Hello, everybody. This is your host, Aram Melkoumov, and you're listening to another episode of the Product Innovation Show. Every week, our guests that we have on our show share their stories and wisdom on how to ship a great product. Really fortunate today, we have Bhaskar Deka, who is the global head of product management and AI at Edcast. In the past, he led product management, data science, and engineering teams in companies like Oracle and Informatica. Bhaskar, amazing to have you on our show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Aram, thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Awesome. So the first question I have for you is, I'm always curious to ask, what AI product, what does it mean to be an AI product leader?
That's a great question, Aram. Obviously, it has the elements of, classic product management, right? But the AI definitely brings a new dimension to it. And, if you think about, and I'll talk about what product management and maybe a little bit about then what product leader part of it is. So when you think about product management, you have your classic, data code part that you have to think about, your technical aspects as needed. But you live in a more deterministic world if you think about non-AI. And here it can be a bit more ambiguous because you're dealing with a lot of experiments. So it won't be A plus B equals C, but depending on the data you're feeding in, depending on the problem space you're in, you're kind of experimenting and learning from it, whether it's a recommendation engine that you're building or sales forecasting. So it definitely needs a slightly different mindset. The other aspect of being an AI product manager is that it's an exciting new field, so a lot of new things are happening. ML ops, where how you do actually models that get deployed in different customer instances. That's an evolving field, so you have to be constantly on your toes to learn and how you can apply to it. And then you're not only dealing with developers anymore, you also have data scientists that you have to work with. So you're writing specs and you're working closely with not only your from a business perspective, but you're working with a data scientist to dealing with data. So data fluency is a very important skill. So altogether, I think you have this additional dimension to being a product manager. And then if you're a product leader where you're now managing a set of product managers, I always, as I build team, I always, as an ex-engineer, I have a little bias towards people with technical skills, even in product management, but I always surrounded myself with a team which had folks with great technical knowledge, but also, more the humanities side of things, behavioral aspects and so forth. Some calls it, poets and quants, right? So you have people with quantitative skills as the other side. I think it becomes even more important when you're building an AI product, because sometimes if you're too much on one side of the things, you're being way too much data driven, but not maybe, bringing in some of the human elements of it, you could be building something which is, not quite right. So altogether, I think it's an exciting field of AI, as a cliche that AI is a new electricity. It's been seeping into, all the major enterprise software. Consumer kind of took the lead with Amazon, Google, investing a lot in the AI side. But now, as you're seeing enterprise software being built, this is my second startup where our core product is all AI driven. AI is the core of what we do. And it's fascinating to see the advancements that has happened and how product management has caught up with that as well.
Very interesting. And my next question I have is, as a product leader working in AI, and I'm probably going to have a few questions around this because it's an interesting topic for us that we've been looking at, is around biases in decision making. So
Yep.
let's talk, maybe just go back to the AI side. How do you remove, or how do you come across biases in AI, if there are any?
So that's a very good question, Aram. So, let me maybe first separate out, bias and decision making, that in a classic product management sense first, then before we get into on the AI side of bias, right? So you have your classic, biases like, confirmation bias is a common cognitive bias. Then you have big customers, whether call it 800-pound gorilla, or sometimes customers which can be very vocal about things, so your roadmap get biased towards that. Then you have things like recency bias, maybe most recently what you've heard. The other one, most common being sunk cost, right? That you invested in something, and then even though it's not really sticking, you're still continue because you made an investment. And then the other one is you're trying to follow others, like over there call it hard mentality in Wall Street or something similar. So I think all of those biases still apply when you're building an AI-based product. Now, the additional dimension that comes to it, to which you rightly pointed out, is how do I, when I'm building a model, how do I not let bias seep into my model itself? And one of our key customers, and I'm not going to name name, but one of the major pharmaceutical companies in the world, as we worked with that, we found that they were so thoughtful about how AI ethics has been taught. I mean, in fact, as we were building the product out and then refining it, that was one of the papers I referred to. And one of the key elements of that was, right from the level of the data representation. And one good example is whatever data sample or representation you're bringing in, you want to make sure that there is no bias towards whether it's certain race or certain sexual orientation and what have you, right? So being very thoughtful about that aspect, I think, is very important. The second part of it is privacy and data privacy, and your bias can be kind of very interrelated on two sides of the same coin. So some of these privacy-related things that you come in, making sure your data is totally anonymized, the way you do clinical trials, and then double blind and so forth. Same aspect you bring in. So I think those aspects, as you take a step back and think through with the proper planning of your data, and then as you're inspecting your model, those are ways that now once the model is in place, there is a way for you to go back and inspect it from your output perspective, and there also you can adjust from some biases. So those are things. And then outside of that, obviously, if you're thinking about machine learning lingo, there's something called bias and variance, which is very different from what we're talking about. But yeah, in general, I think it's a very important topic, and whether it's the Googles of the world, there is an army of folks who are specifically looking at AI ethics, which applies in a big way to the enterprise world.
No, thank you. Mm-hmm. You touched upon something there that I wanted to ask a question around, which was working with larger organizations as clients. Mm-hmm. You get bias in terms of like, well, I want this in the feature roadmap. I want you to build this for me, and then I'll use it or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of pressure to product leaders like yourself or to the product managers to have to consider these type of things into your roadmap. How do you counteract that, or how do you approach that kind of a situation when it comes to be so that you don't get distracted from deviating in the wrong direction ultimately?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question again. Well, first of all, let me start off with the benefits side first, right? So when you're working with some of these big influential customers, on the benefits side, I think many of them or most of them are kind of leaders in that field. I mean, they really push the envelope of your product is because in some case they might be very unique, or they might be trendsetters in a way. So the things that you would try to come up with within your four walls of thinking as a product management team, they will take you to they will have a lot of out of the box thinking outside of what you're doing. So from benefits side, I think it's great when you're working with. I mean, there are so many examples I can draw upon from my career where we were just wowed by how big influential customers will come in. But have you thought about this? And it's not simple things like pushing the envelope of your performance of your product, but really taking you to in a certain direction within the feature set itself. Um, that being said, then you do have that challenge of, with very demanding customers, they could overwhelm your roadmap the way you're saying it. So one, I guess the few approaches that I've seen working, one is being very transparent about the fact that, especially in an enterprise SaaS world, you're building a product which you need to be able to, configure and sell it for, a lot of customers, right? So being transparent about the fact that although those are great features that you're asking for, some of them might be very unique and you might not be able to, fit that in, right? So that's on that setting the expectation side. The other side on the product engineering side is kind of build product with a lot of configurability into it. I mean, it's a SaaS product, but it's amazing how much different things you can do. I mean, we use something called launch darkly, which leaves you can turn on, turn off certain feature sets, or you can tweak it to the nth level in many ways. So I think even as an enterprise SaaS product, you want to do that. The third aspect that comes in is that roadmap acceleration. So it could very well be that that big influencer customer wants something quickly. You don't have the bandwidth from an engineering standpoint to do it. Now, different places I've been, we've called it with different names. One that I normally use it called product solutions, where you might be doing something which is aligned to your product roadmap, but it's something unique to maybe one or two customers. Mm-hmm. And then you can work with them to build that additional product solution as a paid engagement. And then as long as it's core to your product, and either roadmap acceleration or something slightly adjacent to it. And most of the times when you're transparent, you're working with the customer, they'll be open to that. I guess the last aspect that I've seen really working is having a good customer advisory board or a user group, because a lot of times you'll see that not only would they influence other customers, but some unique things they might be asking for as you're discussing in a peer group or in others, they might say, oh, you know what, that thing that I was looking for, actually the other one is more important than what I thought that one was. Or sometimes they will come around and say, yeah, no, I agree with what you're putting in your roadmap after that customer advisory discussion. So again, it's a combination, but all throughout, I think transparency is key. Having that openness about any kind of paid engagement that you could have with product solution is another one I've definitely seen working.
And on this product advisory, that's an internal product advisory team, right? That exists within your company?
So there are typically two kinds. So you have the customer advisory board, which would be a select few customers would be part of that. Mm-hmm. Then you'll meet on a certain cadence, 6 months or 1 year. And then you typically have a user group, which could be done outside, more external, but you'll be invited to share your roadmap and so forth. So it's easily a combination of those two.
Okay. Yeah, because I remember last time we talked about this, you mentioned something around you could form like a team internally in your own organization that could review things that could be from different departments or different elements within mm-hmm. your organization that could review any of these type of kind of new requests, in order to stay objective.
Yep.
To see how it could help. What would that ideal kind of like team look like in terms of what departments or what kind of groups would you want present in that?
Yeah, so I think the one that you're referring to is some kind of a product council, which interestingly product I just council. Came off from my bi-weekly product council. So the typical representatives of a product council is you have your customer-facing folks like your head of customer success, your marketing, your head of sales, or a couple of delegates around it, your engineering, because and in our case we have engineering and the head of quality as well, the head of QA, and then any other and somebody with a strategic role. So typically, what I've seen is then as a collective group, then you come up with some of this, both strategic and operational aspects of product management that you get discussed there. If some decisions you're not able to make as a collective, and you need the veto power of the CEO, then I've seen and I've worked with where the CEO, even though part of product council, most likely delegate the work to the rest of the folks, but would use his or her veto, every once a quarter, if you will, right?
Okay.
But that's I've seen it working really well, and we go through even the notion of go no go for a particular release. You bring it to the product council and say you need to meet a minimum threshold of this many P1, P2 bugs being out of the system, and all the documentation in ready, all the collaterals that's needed for to be customer rollout, and then only like a shuttle launch, electrical go, mechanical go, you will have everybody come together and say, yep, we are ready for it. So that's another operational aspect. I've seen it working really well with the product council.
Okay. No, thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
My next questions that I have are going to be tied to more, I would say, the product management planning side of things. So, you mentioned something interesting when we last spoke, which was the importance of architectural epics and stories being part of the planning process.
Yeah.
And I know like a lot of people take that for granted, and like, we're mindful of those, but unfortunately these things are still missed. And I wanted to get from your perspective, why is it so important that these things are properly given the time of day in the planning process before embarking on any kind of next steps?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, I love Agile. I mean, I think probably, in Oracle, when I was there, we were still in the classic waterfall or maybe spiral model. But past 12 years of my product leadership, it's been all various form of Agile. So great, delivery model. But one thing you have to be careful with Agile is that because you're so narrow focused in, sprint-based delivery, and you're getting constant validation, that unless you're careful, like you rightly pointed out, you might be too much going towards the business epics, but not investing enough of architectural epics. And especially in a startup, it becomes even more important because, you have this whole, product market fit, then you're going with a lot of great customer, penetration, and hopefully everybody is looking for a hockey stick effect and, scaling up. And if you're not being careful, then you could be building a lot of features on the, based on the business epics, but architecturally you're not set up for success, and suddenly you're surprised, right? It's the classic, the performance not being able to up to mark, or even different pieces of integrated pieces are falling apart. So I think every, there are different techniques in an Agile model that you can do. You can do various type of spikes where you're trying out a few things, and then making sure that as part of quality also, you're, from QA process, you're testing a lot of things that can test the tires of your architecture. But, and that's, as a product team, your engineering would always come and tell you about that and say, hey, I need some architectural epics. I think product is under a lot of pressure from business or customers to keep pushing additional features, and this is where you need to take a pause and then listen to your architects, your engineering partners, to make sure that those are properly factored in. So every quarter, that's our, we use SAFe, the model, the scaled Agile process, and every quarter, we as a product team, we do sit back and think through that. It's like, you have a classic sprint planning, but every quarter, are we looking at enough architectural epics along with the business epics?
Okay, awesome. Talking about metrics and how you keep things on track, or what you look for, want to talk about that with you next. As a product leader, product metrics are always things that you need to consider and look, and review against. you've previously mentioned things like delivery predictability as a metric,
Yep.
through burn down charts and things like that.
Mhm.
Why? How do you do that, and why is that important, as a metric for you?
Yeah, no, I think the delivery predictability it has a really big impact on, I don't know whether you call it upstream or downstream, but all the way to the customer. Because when you're sharing the roadmap with your customer, yeah, you put your classic safe harbor saying, some of this might not exactly happen. But if you have done, roadmap presentation that might not a yearly one, and then next year you go back and kind of show that 50% of them didn't get done, you don't look good in front of a customer, whether it's the yearly or quarterly and so forth. So even though you try to put high-level blogs, that's from that perspective. Secondly, it could have a potential churn risk, right? That if you're a lot of times some customers are, competition is always putting pressure, and then if you're not able to deliver on the promise. So delivery predictability is one thing that both me and my engineering partner are very careful about, and it goes down to doing good sizing of your tickets, but also, like you said, having the good burn down charts and understanding about it. So that's the main reason. Now it's easier said than done. I mean, it takes you quite a bit of iterations to get through, and then if you're a engineer, for example, even simple things like you would wait till the last minute to say, hey, I'm done, as opposed to saying, once I'm done, I'm moving to. So some of those numbers could be a bit skewed towards the end of the sprint. So it does take a little bit of extra effort to understand how long it really took for you to deliver, and then what can you learn from it. So sprint retrospective is super important because of that, and as you're learning from each sprint. But yeah, I mean, among the top 10 metrics that I've been tracking as a product leader, delivery predictability is something I always look at as a very important one.
What are some other ones in your top 10?
Yeah, I mean, you have your classic adoption metrics, right? The NPS, outside of NPS, the classic adoption metrics that is very important because it goes back to the sunk cost example I was giving as a bias. That one of the ways you look at that sunk cost aspect is that what's your adoption looks like, and that you should be able to measure in a very quantitative way. And I mean, that nowadays, there were days where you could only do it with Google Analytics with some tricks around it, but now there are so many good product analytics tools, and they're right at the feature level. You can go and take a look at what kind of adoption you're getting. So normally the way I categorize is you have your classic, more from a business standpoint. If you're the cloud metrics, so to speak, and some percentage of it, some section of it, whether it's your monthly recurring revenue and so forth aspects of it. So you have that part. Then you have your adoption metrics, and then part of it could be depending on what kind of product you might even look at the balance of some vanity metrics as well, right? And then you come into more on the delivery side of operation side of it, where product predictability, one that we talked about, comes into play.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one last question before I jump into that fireside hot seat question set I have. But you worked in a lot of products over the years, different companies.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any kind of product or feature that you could tell us about that was like difficult to kind of navigate through, either from the initial get-go or when it was already delivered, you learned that it was like the wrong solution for it? Tell us like how it happened and how would you have approached it differently?
Sure. I think probably there are multiple instances. One that really come to mind from like a couple of startups ago. One was where when we were building, it was a new marketing product we were building. So we were very gung ho about it. It was a CRM product suite, and we were getting great market penetration on it. And then we felt that, and we learned from the market that, a marketing product that does along with the rest of the CRM would be a great fit. You will do also campaign management that will fit into, actually customers using it. So everything looked super good. Now there are two aspects of it. One is you do the digital marketing aspect where we were even, those are the early days of Alexa, Google Home, and we're saying, wow, we can even do that kind of aspect. So it's a new thing. But we found that the customer or the target market segment also used print marketing. And where we went wrong, and I'll take the blame as the product leader, is that I totally underestimated the aspect of print marketing. I thought, well, you can do the same thing. You just use, engage a printing house, and then you can do the same thing. But turned out that was, first of all, the type of business we were in. It had a very different way of, first of all, there were a lot of existing players in that, and they were pretty entrenched in it. There was a process that people within the customer were used to, and even a segment of customers of that business, they were more comfortable with using print materials than digital, right? So long story short, very quickly we learned that not only it's business we shouldn't be getting into, but also we were alienating some partners because they had big, print side of the business. So I think the lesson learned there again was that sometimes you might get a bit tech focused by thinking, oh, I can build this part, but you have to really go in and see how it's used by our customer. And the other aspects, like I said, the partner ecosystem there, about the people who are using it, the big percentage of it. So that was one example. The other example, since I talked about sunk cost, I've done, especially early in my career, where you, without thinking thoughtfully through it, you are mimicking what a competitor might be doing in your product, and you're adding additional feature groups, and that again leads to that whole sunk cost thing. Yeah, it's not really aligns with you. You're better off partnering. I mean, I think a lot of times you say you have your core product, and rather than trying into adjacencies, you're better off with partner. You're actually expanding the pie, and then yes, at some point you might get into it. So those are some of the mistakes that I think we all make, but we learn from it.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right. Fireside format. Couple questions. 1 minute responses. Let's try our best to get through some of these so that we could get some wisdom out there quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question I have is interesting one is what aspects of product development money can't fix?
What aspects of problem money can't fix? Yeah. That's a great one. I guess the way I would look at it is, if you have the wrong product strategy, it's about building the right product versus building product right, if you think about it that way. Now, if you don't have the right product strategy and then, the right product that you're thinking about, then it doesn't matter, it's not only the money, you put the best engineers on it, then what will come out is not something that you'll be able to, position in the market. So,
so true.
Yeah.
Products, you can't use money to fix your product strategy. That's so true. Thank you. Next question I have would be around asking your users what to build next. When would you not do that?
Yeah, so that one is, I think, that the classic Henry Ford saying, right? That if I had asked my users, they would say they need a faster horse.
Faster horse.
Yeah, and then Steve Jobs also talked about the fact that sometimes the users don't know what they want. So I think when you're trying something disruptive, when you're really out there with some innovation, that's where I think you need to kind of take the lead on, and then yeah, you'll find those early adopters or mavens. But if you go out and try to do it focus group, then most likely you'll kind of come back with some answers which is not what you're looking for. So I think, for an established product, when you have it out there and then you're learning from your users, is a bit different than when you're coming up with something very disruptive and innovative.
Okay. Is there any point in the product development that throwing money at the problem would solve it?
Yes, I think that's the reverse of what we talked earlier. When you have the right product, you have the right product strategy, and now you have the product market fit, right? So now at that point, you're thinking about either scaling up maybe from the product feature perspective, or maybe you're doing geographical expansion. You have had great success here in the US. Now you're getting into the European market or the Asian market. And it's a classic way of, since we are in the startup world, when you go from Series A, Series B, Series C, that's where you need the money, because now you've proven yourself, and you can build up both on the product side as well as on the sales side.
Okay, that's very true. Happens all the time with scaling companies. All right, a few more, and then we'll wrap it up. This one's an interesting one, but what do you believe in that other people think is insane?
Oh, that's a great one. I think so I spent half of my career in big companies. Like Oracle Informatica, I learned a lot. But past say 8-9 years, I've been in startup. I think, and I'm not being a founder. I'm usually the founding head of product. I would say that's a classic story of a founder or founding members of a startup, because you must be crazy to think that this will work. You're going against either some existing big behemoths, or you're coming up with something new idea. So I'll give an example from one of the startups that, and again, I wasn't the founder, but we were building a CRM product for the automotive industry. Now, there are already a lot of established CRM products, and Salesforce included. Another question is there a market for just focusing on automotive, whether it's the car dealerships or car makers of the world? Why not you take an Oracle and Salesforce and customize for it? Turned out that actually it was a fairly complex thing, especially when where we played, which was the service department. A typical car, I'm not a car guy, but typical car has about 28,000 parts, and then the maintenance menu is just insane. So when you look at something like that and say, yes, there'll be a market, there'll be other aspects, the horizontal aspects of it, which is common to all the CRMs, but the vertical aspect, there's a market for it. For you to believe in it, then build a company around it. It could look like insanity, but I think that's what for most of the startups, or as I said, the founding members of the startup look like.
Yeah, no, it's true. Sometimes you got to be a bit crazy to get into building a company from day one. So
yeah,
it's a very true example of that type of niche. All right, last question for you is, all your knowledge you have now, what would be your advice to a 30-year-old you?
Oh, would I want to be 30-year-old? Absolutely. Well, I think I've been very fortunate to have tried different things. I mean, I was part of my career, I was in engineering management. Then I've done, even though I'm a product leader, I've done a little bit of product marketing in between as well. So one thing I'll go back and tell my 30-year-old, even though I've been adventurous in these aspects, is that take even more risk. It's okay to fail. I think your failure tolerance, as you go higher up, but I think it reduces a little bit, even the level of responsibility you have. But when I'm 30, one thing I look back and see is that I could have been spend a little bit of time in sales as well. That's one area where you have an actual quota, and I have a lot of respect for salespeople because of that. You're driven by a quarterly quota, and then how you have to be both in some cases hunter or a farmer. So if I could, that's probably one thing I'll do: spend a year or two in sales, because a big part of product leadership is that salesmanship. I mean, only salesmanship won't get you to where you want to be, but it's an important aspect of it. I mean, one of my thing to my team is that you have to be the best advocate for your product when you're out there, with your customers and analysts. But also you have to be the worst critic when you're building the product, and you're with your engineering, you're trying to fix, so forth. So that earlier part, I think probably would have learned more if I had spent a bit of time in sales myself. So that's probably what I'll do.
I love that. I think everybody should spend a little bit of time in sales. It helps you with everything that you do.
Yeah.
Selling people, to convince people around your idea, your strategy. So very true. I love that.
Yeah.
So we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much, Bhaskar, for coming on our show and sharing that wealth of knowledge of yours over these, years of experience you have. And always thank you to our listeners for tuning in, supporting the show, and following us. So thank you again, Bhaskar. It was great having you today.